Across Newcastle and the Hunter too, and you are FM 103.7. Time to have a look at some of the events that are happening in the world of politics. We do that with our Professor of Politics from the University of Newcastle, Dr. Jim Jose. And Jim, a bit of a different world. Firstly, welcome back. I haven't seen you in here for a while.
Yeah, good to be back, Mark.
Good to be back.
To see you.
Forgot what you look like for a while. With all the issues and the different kind of a world that we have at the moment, there is a few of those things that we just can't get away from being compelled to do. One, you have to get out and do some shopping. Another one that jumps up is voting. Of course, we've got council elections that have been kicked down the road a couple of months. Federal election that many would think probably will be the early quarter of next year. The idea of compulsory voting or removing that has come up again.
Yes, it's sort of interesting. I mean, in part, it's being debated, or not so much compulsion in the US because it's voluntary in the US, but they are debating amendments to various aspects of the federal voting provisions, and part of that is the Democrats wanting to restore some of the things that were removed in 2013, I think it was, by the US Supreme Court in the then existing Voting Rights Acts, which basically meant that if states which had a history of discrimination against people of colour in particular, if they were wanting to change the voting laws in their state that would impact negatively on people of colour, they had to get, in effect, to run these changes past the federal government and get approval for that. The Supreme Court knocked that down, which basically has led to 10 years of various activities in which voting rights have been restricted. And one of these sorts of things has spilled over into Australia, with some of these sort of federal politicians beginning to articulate some of the sorts of arguments in the US about who should vote and who shouldn't vote, who should have the right to vote. And one of the really tricky bits is that in the US, the debate has shifted in particular around it's a privilege to vote, and therefore being a right is not an issue, it's a privilege. And that change in language signals, in a sense, a way in which you can then begin to discriminate against those people who you might feel abuse their privilege because of their behaviour, and they're not proper citizens and all that sort of thing. Those issues around privilege and right and duty, they were at the heart of the debates in Australia in the late 19th century, early 20th century, at the federal level when compulsory voting was first implemented in 1925, but at the state level at different times when they were being debated, there was a really strong sense that citizenship wasn't just simply automatic, that part of being a citizen in Australia was to be exercising the right to vote, and that it was as much a duty as it was a right. And in some cases, the sense of it being a privilege was that in a democracy, the right to vote being a duty was also part of the privilege of being in a democracy. Now, at the turn of the century, when these things were being argued, the argument that there was somehow an infringement on one's liberty was so far in the background of arguments. For the most part, it was about ensuring that every citizen had their voice heard.
And that's where, if we bring that to a modern context there, Jim, we know that there are a lot of people that, if compulsory voting was removed, probably just would say, look, bugger that, I'm going to stay at home. Why would I bother? My vote doesn't really mean much anyway. Because there are still a bundle of people that still vote informally or write a few bits of colourful language on the form anyway. I have a theory, though, if we remove compulsory voting, which, to be honest, I'm for. I think it's a great idea. Because if you don't vote, I think you forfeit the right to complain over the next few years. But my theory is if we remove compulsory voting immediately, there'd be a whole swag of people in the, let's call them the sensible centre, that would just sit this one out because they aren't as engaged in politics as those on the fringe, whether they're left, right, or whatever.
Yeah, it's an interesting perspective.
I reckon we'd have a hugely different parliament if that was to take place.
Possibly, and I suspect that the first time around it would be radically different to what it is now.
Maybe it's the shake-up we'd need.
But this was a similar sort of scenario back at as the franchise was being established and universalised, that the only those who were committed to the political game and the politics of the day would turn out to vote. And in the early days, before they settled on voting in using schools as voting booths and stuff, there were votes were taking place, polling booths were taking place in all sorts of places with all sorts of, shall we say, picturesque activities. And often people would turn out to the vote, not to vote, but just simply to watch those who were turning out to vote.
It's just the fun and games.
Engage in the fun and games. The logic, though, at the time that compulsory voting was eventually adopted, and the logic that prevailed was, again, that every citizen needed to have a say, and that those who were elected needed to be elected by the vast majority of the population, not just those who happened to turn out on the day. And curiously enough, different political parties saw partisan advantage in it. And for example, in Queensland, when it was first introduced by a Liberal government, they thought that they would be able to stem the tide against the Labor Party and that they would gain the ascendancy politically and be assured of another term in Parliament. As it happened, when they introduced it, it worked the other way and there was a 5% swing to Labor, and Labor stayed in power for another 14 or 15 years as a result. Again, from the Labor side of politics, they also saw that there would be a political advantage at the, and at the federal level, they thought that they would gain that advantage. The issue of informal voting, let me just quickly pick up on that, Mark, because it's actually really low. It's a very low percentage.
But it's swinging seats that can make all the difference.
Oh, certainly. And one of the problems with the voting system, if I can put it in that language, one of the problems is that the outcome of elections is often decided by half a dozen seats. And perhaps we need to look at the way the system is set up in order to return representatives. Maybe the single-member electorate is not necessarily the best way of ensuring reasonable representation and appropriate representation. Maybe we need to think about other types of voting systems, but the core element of compulsory voting, when it was introduced, very few, in fact, I think there was probably one speech in the federal parliament claiming that it was an infringement of liberty, and that was by a Labor Party member, and he then concluded his speech by saying it is Labor Party policy that we will support compulsory voting, and therefore, as a member of the party, I will support it, but personally I'm opposed to it.
My view is this.
The Country Party, the forerunner of the National Party, it was totally in support of compulsory voting, and the National Party that was in government at the time basically had no policy on it, but the Prime Minister of the day, Stanley Bruce, said that if this is the way that the party wants to go, then I will abide by that. And basically that's sort of how it all unfolded back in the very early 1920s. And 1924, the compulsory voting was approved in Parliament. And in 1925, they had the first election under compulsory voting. And I think there was something like a huge turnout. And it's been in the high 90s ever since, up to 95%. And one final point on the compulsion. Technically, you have to mark the ballot paper.
Yes.
Technically, but in practice, because it's secret ballot, no one is inspecting whether you mark the ballot paper or not. So basically, it's only, in effect, in practice, it's only compulsory to go in and be signed off and get your ballot paper. What you do with the ballot paper after that is secret business, and if you mark it, fine. If you don't, no one knows, and just as long as you put the ballot paper in the ballot box, all is above board. So in practice, people, if they think it's all a waste of time, they can pull back and not actually cast a vote as such. But when you go to the polling booth, you see it's a bit like a party in many respects. People really seem to enjoy themselves once they're actually at the polling booth.
Yeah, some do.
It's a uniquely Australian experience.
Yeah, and I'll very quickly finish by saying if you are one of the people that just put the blank paper in or write something on that doesn't vote one way or the other, I think you should shut up for the next 3 years because you're actually not having a say. All right, that's Jim Joseph, Professor of Politics. Thanks, Jim. Talk to you soon.
My pleasure, Mark.
2NURFM 103.7.